interested in your thoughts.
This is another good example too of what I've been trying to get at, which is that building that culture of resistance I think needs to be there for this kind of action to happen. And Earl, you were talking about the Latino workers, the Mexican workers in particular, being key in this. A lot of them had at least some experience with the 2006 marches. A few of them had very direct experience because their spouses and so on were involved in organizing in those marches, but a lot of them had participated in some capacity, or at least had seen that. And my understanding is that that was definitely one of the factors in terms of their education and their consciousness raising, that they could do something like that because of what had been accomplished in the big immigration march in 2006. So that's a perfect example, again, of what you were saying. I didn't hear a lot about the tension between Black and Latino workers in the past like you have. I'm sure that is true. I just didn't hear a lot about that. And one thing I was very impressed with was that there were really key leaders from both groups that were very close and played a big role. You saw, they call him Melvin Macklin or Ricky Macklin. He was one of the key leaders, vice president of the local. The president of the local was one of the Latino leaders, Armando Robles, who you heard Terry refer to, was very militant. It's funny to hear the various things he wanted to do when the factory was closed. He was pissed. But there were. I mean, you also saw Ron Bender, who I think was one of the most conscious of the workers. He sometimes not talked about as much because he didn't have a leadership position. But when I was out there interviewing, he's one of the African American workers. And when I was interviewing people, he was always one of my favorite to go to, actually, because he just understood the kind of wider context of this struggle. So there were both African American and Latino workers, I felt, that played key roles. So I didn't hear as much what you were talking about, but I'm sure that that was there. I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I might have sensed some of that, but again, I don't think it was explicit at all, and probably no more than. And I didn't hear. I mean, at other workplaces I reported on, I've heard people say that management intentionally, caused and exploited divisions. I didn't actually hear that about Republic. I got the sense that the owner was so, removed from and what's the word, looked down so much on the workers that he didn't even go to the lengths it would take to, manipulate people. And I think, even going beyond the Black Latino issue, it really just, because of the economic crisis and, the widespread anger against the banks and just distrust of the whole system, it brought all sorts of people together. I mean, the unions that in the past would have not associated with the UE in that sense, the more mainstream unions and business people even, and all sorts of, top politicians. I mean, Obama himself is speaking in support of workers who are actually doing something technically illegal. So I think, just so many walls that might normally have been there just fell down, because of it. Not to mention it was right before Christmas and it was like a blizzard and, it threw a lot of agitation. And so there really was just, I think, this feeling on all sides. I mean, even, Fox News was having sort of commentary sympathetic to the workers. So just I feel some kind of feeling of solidarity that, popped up in unexpected places, going way beyond even, I think, maybe some racial tensions that might have been there.
I have two questions. One's very specific and one's a little broader. The specific question is, exactly how did the direct action lead to the plant reopening being resold and reopening? I'm not clear why that would be the case. And the second is there any effort, coordination to monitor these WARN impacts to see how many plants are affected and how many workers are affected and what's happened to them and whether the laws followed and to sort of highlight it if it isn't, or that kind of thing. So those are the two questions.
Maybe I can address both of them briefly, but the WARN one first. The General Accounting Office did a big study on WARN violations, and basically it's violated all the time, and with total impunity, because there are so many loopholes into it, which I could go on about.
Well, go on a little bit because
I mean, one of them is for unforeseeable business circumstances. So almost anything can be described as unforeseeable. Also, if a company is not declaring bankruptcy, because WARN Act applies to mass layoffs as well as closings. So if a company, if giving the notice would interfere with the company's ability to get new investors, which is logical enough, then they can claim that gets them out of giving WARN Act notice or paying severance pay. So, huge loopholes. Not to mention that even when none of the loopholes apply, the court process is still so slow. And so anyway, it is violated all the time. And And the House bill would make it a lot stronger. I'm not sure if anything similar has been introduced in the Senate or, what's gonna happen with that, but anyway, so yeah, Warren Act doesn't do much. And Bank of America actually got in trouble for violating the Warren Act itself. Well, it didn't get in trouble, but it was charged, it was charged with violating the Warren Act by its own employees, and Bank of America was actually doing some shifty things where it would lay off people in small groups to try to, avoid triggering the Warren Act. And then just real briefly on your first point, as far as how did the occupation lead to the company reopening, it was a handful of steps, which come down to really just how brilliant and effective the union strategy ended up being. The occupation led to all the attention, and then all the attention led, one, to the banks giving the money, but then two, to Serious Materials seeing this and thinking, we want a Midwestern plant, because they did want to get a plant in the Midwest anyway. And then here's a great, and then, do a good deed, get good PR. So that, all the attention is what caused them to buy the plant. So yeah, that's,
Yeah, I mean, if it hadn't been for the occupation, this would have just slipped into the night, like every other, factory that closed like this, and nobody would have, heard from it about it again. The fact that the workers took a stand, took a militant stand, is the only reason that they were able to save those jobs. So that's, and because the publicity garnered, that's why Serious Materials got a hold of the union then and said, hey, we're interested in maybe buying this place. So that's the explanation of that first part. And just to add to what you're saying about the Warren Act, Adam Taylor's here as well. He's with the works with the organization Rise Chicago. It's tied in with the Interfaith Committee on Worker Issues, which Kim Bowen, the executive director, just did a really good book on wage theft, and she mentions the issue of the Warren Act in there. It's kind of within that wider context of the issue of wage theft that is being starting to finally be discussed more in this country. How many ways that companies, skirt the law and steal workers' wages. There's a whole variety of ways they do that. So I encourage you to check that book out as well in that regard.
This immediate direct militant action was what really set and looked apart, and then as far as looking at it moving forward, as if if we look at UB as an example and at Revolt as an example. I mean, you said yourself, if the police had come in and arrested every worker on the first day, that this might happen, and that does happen all the time. So I guess how to deal with an issue that luckily didn't happen in this particular event, and we get to look at this event and say, okay, if everything works out, it can happen. You don't have to wait years. You don't have to wait. There are problems, but basic things can be fulfilled. So I guess that's one other problem, foreseeable problem in similar situations that happens and didn't happen a year ago.
It's a very complicated question. It's not going to be easily answered by one solution. Factory operations alone are not going to be the one answer to this. There's all kinds of other types of direct actions that can be taken. There's one of the, I think, most interesting developments right now within the union movement is the development of worker centers, the development of what they call minority unions. This is where you don't necessarily have a union contract. You have minority workers that may be members of the organization, but they can use direct action tactics to win things at the workplace. One of the people that have done this very successfully many times in the past is a group that I belong to, the IWW, a very union with a long, long history. It's again very small, but they've actually, at Starbucks and other places like that, they've been able to get just a small group of workers together. And there's a cover of law that's given to worker concerted action in the workplace. And so you can take direct action oftentimes and be within the law. And it's amazing how oftentimes you can win serious things by doing that. We really have to move away from kind of the very traditional idea and approach to organizing that's been taken for far too long and it's led to failure after failure. I've talked with Mark Weinstein, I've talked with Leah Fried at UE about this issue. It's not an easy issue, but that, again, the situation in Quincy is a perfect example of how you can't just necessarily take one case and then apply it to the other just like a cookie cutter. And that's a situation too where the workers in Quincy had a lot of communication with the public workers. They were visiting all the time, talking about it, sharing ideas, but they just weren't at the same level. They weren't at the same point. They weren't quite. And then, I should be careful what I'm saying because I don't know how much this is for public consumption to the conversation I had with them. But there were a whole variety of factors there. There was the company in some ways was much more perhaps ingenious in how they handled the Quad Cities thing. It took a lot longer for that to occur. There's this debate in some ways, you've brought some of your book about how much of the public